Hello, this is Dr. James Strickler, and this is a course in United States history. This lecture deals with Chapter 21, World War I, in the United States history textbook, American Yawp. World War I was known at the time as the Great War. It was the Great War because the world had not seen a war of these proportions and this destructiveness before. It involved many major European powers who still had colonies spread around the globe. It also involved the United States, so it reached across the Atlantic Ocean. It went on for years with a destructiveness that had never been seen before because of the invention of modern weaponry, tanks, machine guns, airplanes, chemical weapons, etc. So this was a destructive war beyond anything anyone had ever seen. Thus, it was the Great War to them during this time. Let's first begin this chapter by discussing the prelude, the things that led up to the Great War. The origin of the Great War can rightly be traced back to the ascension of Wilhelm II to the kingship over Germany. He was called Kaiser Wilhelm. Now, in this position, he felt in some ways inadequate. He was the grandson of Queen Victoria of England. Now, to understand that, how you could have the German king being the grandson of the English queen, you have to understand how monarchies operated in Europe. If you were of royalty, you could only marry other royalty. Now, if you didn't want to marry your cousins, you had to marry royalty from other countries. That's how the royal families of Europe all ended up intermarried. Well, when Wilhelm looked at his kins and his relatives in England and saw the great empire that the British had built around the world, at the time it was said that the sun never set on the British Empire because of its possessions stretching all the way from Australia to South Africa to India to islands in the Caribbean, etc. When he looked at that empire stretching around the world, he felt jealous. He felt inadequate. He felt like Germany should have an empire like that too. And so he began to pursue the formation of German colonies around the world too. He began to build up the German military to rival that of the other nations around him. And this began to make the other nations nervous. Wilhelm's Germany entered into a pact with two other powers in the central portion of Europe, Italy and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This became known as the Central Alliance. Later they would be referred to as the Central Powers. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a similarly ambitious empire to Germany. It was a nation that saw itself as expanding out, eventually to gobble up the smaller countries to its southeast. Now this will end up creating a problem also. Well, as the countries around this Triple Alliance, around the Central Powers, saw them working together with an aggression to expand their territory, those countries got nervous. This led to Great Britain, France, and Russia forming their own alliance, called the Triple Entente Alliance. Now that word entente is a French word, which refers to it being an informal alliance. They didn't have a firm set of treaties that bound them together. Nonetheless, they saw a common interest in trying to stand up against the expansion of Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This is a concern for France and Great Britain as they saw the small countries as Belgium and Netherlands as potentially falling prey to Germany. This is a concern for Russia as they saw the countries to the southeast of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, what are today called the Balkans, potentially falling prey to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Russia was particularly concerned about this because they felt an ethnic brotherhood with the people down there. Russians, as well as people like the Serbians, are Slavic people. They are, in their heritage, in their ethnic heritage, a separate people from the people of Western Europe. And so Russia felt some need to kind of protect those people in that area to the southeast of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They didn't want the Austro-Hungarians to expand there. So they entered into this alliance with Germany and France as a defensive alliance against possible aggression from the Triple Alliance that we can also call the Central Powers. Another player in this potential conflict was the Ottoman Empire. This was a Muslim empire that encompassed present-day Turkey and countries below it around the Arabian Peninsula. Countries that today are Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, were all under the influence of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire also had its eyes on that portion of Southeast Europe where the small Slavic countries existed. Earlier in its history, the Muslims had spread into southern Europe there, and they had left many Muslims behind, even as they lost wars during the time of the Crusades and had to withdraw. And so this was a potential battle area between Christians and Muslims in southeastern Europe, and the Ottoman Empire wanted to be a part of it. Well, with all these various interests and alliances in place, we just needed a match to set off the fuse that led to an explosion of conflict. And that match came with the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He was the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was a prince, and he was on a tour through those Balkan countries, and he was in Serbia at the time when an assassin approached his car and shot him dead. That assassin, Gavrilo Princip, had tried to kill him earlier in the day with a bomb and failed, and then by random chance ended up at the same place at the same time as him and pulled out his gun and shot him dead. Well, the assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne by a Serbian separatist led to an aggressive response from the Austro-Hungarians. Now, before I detail what that response was, I have to point out something about United States history first. The United States had a long history, stretching all the way back to our founding and our first president, George Washington, of avoiding entanglement with foreign alliances. We knew that the countries of Europe frequently squabbled with each other, and we didn't want to be caught in the middle of it. We wanted to remain neutral with the possibility of doing business with anybody in Europe. We were afraid that something would happen to us as it would eventually happen to the countries of Europe here, as illustrated in this cartoon. Something happens in Serbia, which makes Austria mad, and then Austria gets involved, which makes Russia mad, which then makes Germany mad, which gets them involved, which then leads to France joining the fight, and then Great Britain. It sets off a sequence where an offense that really has nothing to do with you can end up leading you into war. The United States had historically tried to avoid such things. And so at the beginning of these conflicts in Europe, the United States tried to remain neutral. Now, as the United States is remaining neutral, though, it has its own things to be concerned about. Now, one of these was brewing trouble with Mexico, which I will detail in just a moment. The United States, because of that brewing trouble with Mexico, ended up passing a law called the National Defense Act in 1916. This helped to establish a more workable system of National Guard and military reserve units than had existed before. The United States had a long history of avoiding having a standing army. Our founding fathers thought that a standing army, in other words, an army just sitting around waiting for a war to happen, was actually a threat to the people of the country itself. If the government had this big war machine at its disposal, it might use it against the people. But if we didn't have a standing army around, what do we do during a time of war? Well, then we mobilize people to join the army there and then. Under old military systems, with old military technology, it was possible to do that. Wars were slow to get going during a time in which ships sailed with sails, and people rode on horses into battle. But as war becomes mechanized, as it becomes powered by coal and gasoline, you may not be able to wait. So the United States had to start improving its military readiness. Each state had its own militia, which answered to the governor of the state. The National Defense Act of 1916 provided a system where the U.S. government would provide funding to help trade those local militias. And in exchange, they would become part of a National Guard system that could be called up in defense of the country if need be. It also created a system where people in the military could go into an inactive status in which they were held in reserve, but through which the government could call them back up to fight at any time they wanted to. These sorts of systems of militias and reserve units had long been used in Europe, allowing them to quickly mobilize large numbers of people for their standing armies, which also existed as they always felt threatened by their neighbors. We began to create those similar systems in the United States too, with this act in 1916. But it was going to take more than that to raise the U.S. military up to the same level of the other countries in the world. We had felt safe for a long time by the fact that we were protected on both sides by vast oceans. But the world was changing, and we were about to get involved in military conflict around the world. We would need a modern military. Now, what had prompted the Defense Act in 1916 was a conflict with Mexico in 1914. A new government had come to power in Mexico that was frankly anti-American. And there was concern that they were going to ship in arms from Germany to potentially mobilize against the United States. When the United States found out about this, we sent troops into the port city of Veracruz and took control of it to prevent the German shipment of arms from landing. This was done through the United States Marines, soldiers that are kept, on ships. That's why they're called Marines, that can be deposited around the world for small battles, in this case to temporarily take over this Mexican city. Now what happened was, under this sort of pressure from the United States, the anti-American government in Mexico fell. And we'll talk in a moment about what happened after that. But the important thing about this right now is it shows that what military might America did have was through its Navy. We had ships that we could send places, and they could drop troops off for temporary things like this. And with our vast economy that we developed during this time period, we certainly had the capacity to have a big, powerful military. But to this point, it was limited to these sort of little skirmishes. This is all we had needed to send outside the United States during this time period. Now, the value of having a powerful Navy to assert our will on neighboring countries led to, in 1916, the passage of the Naval Act to improve the Navy, make it capable of competing with any other naval force from around the world. This was important for eventually the United States becoming an important world military power. But now back to what was going on in Mexico. When the anti-American government fell and was replaced by a pro-American government, not all Mexicans were willing to go along with this. And a Mexican rebel named Pancho Villa staged a series of skirmishes with the United States from 1916 to 1917. He first invaded a small town in New Mexico, and in response to that, the United States government sent in the U.S. military to try to chase him down and bring him to justice. They pursued him through Mexico for more than a year without capturing him. But think about this. We had the U.S. Army wandering through a sovereign neighbor state of Mexico, trying to chase down a Mexican citizen. In some ways, it was a travesty that our U.S. Army was trying to chase this guy and couldn't catch him. But we began to learn lessons that would be helpful when eventually we get involved in World War I. We began to learn how to string out supply lines through enemy territories, how to move troops, how to mobilize troops, how to train troops. It was an important lead up to the First World War. America, as the First World War broke out in Europe, declared its neutrality. President Wilson gave a speech specifically saying that we would remain neutral, that we would not take sides, that we would want to do business with both sides. This is an attitude that common Americans happily endorsed. So we tried to go about engaging trades with both Great Britain and France, as well as Germany on the other side. These were historical trading partners, and we still wanted to do business with both. But in reality, we ended up doing a lot more business with the English and the French. And there's some reason for this. One is historically we would traded with them more. The other was they weren't quite as difficult to trade with. What happened was the Germans and the British tried to blockade each other's trade. Any ships trying to get across the Atlantic Ocean might be stopped by the British to make sure that they weren't trying to take anything to the Germans. And if they were, they might have their goods confiscated. They might have their sailors put in prison. Any of those kind of things could happen. That was a big annoyance. But at the same time, if we had ships going across the ocean to do business with England, the Germans might well sink them using their submarine fleet. So we were faced with a problem where we were trying to do business with both, and both were trying to prevent us. But nonetheless, it was easier to do business with England, a more reliable historic trading partner, and one that was being less aggressive in its war efforts against us. So as a natural consequence, while we claimed to be neutral, we did a lot more business with the allies of Great Britain and France. And we also were willing to ship things to them that maybe we shouldn't have if we were being neutral, such as weapons and munitions. This led to the Germans becoming even more aggressive in their attempts to blockade U.S. trade across the Atlantic. They began to sink more and more ships, including the passenger liner Lusitania in 1915. They believed that it was shipping weapons. The official story was that it only had passengers. It probably had both. But the important thing is that when the Germans sunk the Lusitania, it went down with many Americans on board. Now, this loss of American lives, up to more than 100 dying on the sinking ship, changed American public attitudes about neutrality. We began to get ready to go to war against the Germans. Now let's get back to how war actually spread across Europe during this time period. The first thing to note is that after the assassination of the Archduke in Serbia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire issued a series of ultimatums to Serbia. You don't need to know exactly what these ultimatums were, but they were a series of demands of what Serbia do, or else Austria would go to war with them. This was seen as retaliation for the Austro-Hungarian prince having been killed. Now, these ultimatums were specifically designed to be so demanding that of course Serbia would refuse to comply with them, which would then give the Austro-Hungarians the excuse to go to war with Serbia and make it part of their empire. Well, once the Serbians were attacked by the Austro-Hungarians, then this led to the Russians declaring war on the Austro-Hungarians. Remember before I talked about that Russia felt an obligation to defend the Serbians and the other Slavs there in southeastern Europe. Well, once the Russians declared war on the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then Germany declared war on Russia. Then France, an ally of the Russians, declared war on Germany. And very soon we had most of the major countries in Europe at war with each other. Well, Germany had a plan for winning this war. This was called the Schlieffen Plan. And the Schlieffen Plan was to eliminate France as quickly as possible as the greatest threat to Germany. Now, the difficulty for Germany attacking France is that the border between the two countries is not very good for moving troops across. It's heavily forested. There's rivers to cross. The more easily accessible way for Germany to invade France would be to cross the Low Countries that it bordered with, the countries of Netherlands and Belgium. These are supposedly neutral countries. And so when the German military came rolling through them, this was a violation of this neutrality. This then led England to declare war upon Germany also, for the violation of the neutrality of Netherlands and Belgium by Germany's attack upon them, which was just a preliminary for Germany's attack upon France. Once the big powers of Europe were all engaged in war with each other, it ended up quickly degenerating into a stalemate. This was because of the use of trenches. The way to avoid getting shot by a tank or a machine gun, as these modern weapons came into play, is to hide in the ground. So long trenches were dug where soldiers could avoid the worst of the weaponry fire. But this meant with both sides in trenches, there was no way to move the other side. And the line of combat between these big groups of armies just froze. On one side were the Germans trying to invade and take over on France. On the other side were the French and the English trying to defend themselves. The war was quickly in a stalemate. Now, out at sea, Germany was doing better because Germany had a large collection of submarines called U-boats for underwater boats. They could move about the Atlantic Ocean, sinking ships that were trying to bring supplies to the German and the French. Now, this process of sinking the ships helped the Germans, but it also angered the Americans more and more. Another thing that angered the Americans a great deal was the Zimmermann telegram. A German diplomat sent a coded telegram, you can see it here, it's just a bunch of numbers, to government officials in Mexico in 1917. He offered German assistance, weapons and supplies, if Mexico would invade the United States to try to regain the lost territories of Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. Now, this offer was rejected by Mexico, but the United States government became aware of it, and the public then became aware of it. The strategic value of this for the Germans was if the United States could be involved in a war in Mexico, then the United States would not come to war against the Germans, and the Germans believed they could eventually beat down the French and the English and win the First World War. What would turn the tide is if the massive industrial power and the soldiers of the United States came in on the side of the Allies, France, Germany, and Russia. France, England, and Russia. That would turn the tide against the Germans. So the Germans desperately wanted to keep the United States out of the war until they had beat the Allies. They thought getting Mexico involved to cause conflict for the United States would be the way to do it. It had the exact opposite result. When the public found out about this German meddling, then public opinion swung wildly around to let's go to war against the Germans. This then led to America entering the war. Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, gave a speech saying that we should go to war, and quickly after, the United States Congress declared war. When Wilson gave his speech, he claimed that the reason that the United States was going to war was to make the world safe for democracy. His feeling was that if Germany won the war, then this would invite a period of authoritarian rule across Europe. You would have dictators and kings ruling, rather than parliaments and congresses. Therefore, to make the world safe for a proper democratic sort of government to survive, we needed to defeat the Germans. Now, I've mentioned already in this discussion that the United States had a long history of not having a large standing army. And when we have needed to increase the size of the army, historically we depended on volunteers. People just being convinced that it was a righteous cause and volunteering themselves to fight. But on occasion, such as during the Civil War, a draft did take place. This is called conscription, when the government forces people to join the military. That historically had been viewed negatively by Americans. You may recall from a previous lesson in U.S. history that when the draft was imposed during the Civil War, there was a lot of bad reaction to it. There were riots over it as people voiced their disagreement with the idea of having a draft. Well, to get an army, though, up quickly, to go fight in the First World War, just asking for volunteers wasn't sufficient. So in 1917, the United States Congress passed the Selective Service Act, in which people would be required to go fight if they were drafted. Now, to avoid some of the conflicts of the Civil War draft, no longer could you buy your way out of this draft. In the Civil War, you could, if you were drafted, go pay somebody else to take your place. This ended up creating an army of lower class, poor people, while the rich people sat at home. During the Civil War, sometimes people claimed that it was a rich man's war but a poor man's fight, as the actual soldiers out there dying were from the lower class, because they took the money from the rich people to go in their place. Well, the Selective Service Act of 1917 would not allow people to do that. Instead, communities would be told to gather up a certain number of people, and then they would hold a lottery of sort in their own community to decide who would actually go. It was a lot more even-handed and fair, as people from all economic groups might have an equal chance of serving. Once they were in the army had to figure out what to do with them. And this would oftentimes be based on how intelligent they were. This would decide what sort of job they could be assigned. Those who could actually read and write were administered the Army's Alpha test. Those who could not read and write, either because they were just illiterate or they were immigrants to the country who had not learned how to speak or read English, were instead given a visual test called the Beta test, in which a tester would tell them what to do. So for example, there on the second line of this illustration, the pictures 5, 6, 7, and 8, the person was told to complete the drawing. So for example, number 6, you would assume they would notice that the rabbit is missing an ear and add the missing ear. Or in 7, notice that the light bulb is missing a filament and add the filament. Now their capacity to correctly draw on this test would then be used to determine their intelligence. What the Army ended up finding was the average intellectual age of the recruits that they were getting was only 13 years old. Among those who joined the Army were black men. This was because many leaders in the black community encouraged black young men to volunteer. This was in line with the views of Booker T. Washington that we talked about in the previous chapter, that the way to eventually get full equal treatment in the United States of America was to demonstrate to white Americans what good citizens blacks were. And one of the ways to do this was showing a willingness of people of African descent to go out and fight for the United States of America as their country too. Now, once they got in the Army, though, they faced heavy discrimination. There was a belief among Army leaders that white and black troops could not work together. So for the most part, black troops were kept behind the lines to provide services, such as cooks and cleaning and moving around supplies, things like that. They were not allowed to go to the front line and fight. Now, there were rare exceptions, such as the unit seen in this picture here. This is a group of black men that were assigned to fight with the French, who, the French, while having similar racist views to white Americans, had a history of fighting alongside people of other ethnic and racial groups. France had colonies around the world, and they had invited, long through their history, people who lived in those colonies to come and fight for the French military. So the French were more comfortable working with black soldiers. And in this case, this black unit, you can see they've all been awarded medals for their heroism as they fought with the French on behalf of the Allies as United States soldiers. But they were the exception. American foot soldiers, members of the U.S. Army, who were not either in motorized vehicles or on horseback, but who moved from one place to another on foot, who were officially known as the infantry, were commonly known by Americans during this time period as doughboys. We don't know where that nickname came from for sure, but it was widespread during this time period. The bulk of soldiers who were brought into the army, either through as volunteers or as conscripts, were put into the infantry to walk on foot, to fight with rifles, and they were commonly known among Americans as doughboys. Women were also given limited opportunities to participate in the First World War on behalf of the U.S. military. They did this as support personnel. Examples of this are the hello girls that worked for the U.S. Army, taking care of answering phones. Now, the good thing about this, if you're operating the Army, is if you have women behind the lines to answer the phones, then you don't have to have men answering the phones, which means those men can be given a gun to go out and fight instead. In the Navy, you had women who were yeomen. Yeomen provided clerical services for the Army. They might work in an office behind a desk processing paper. They might provide other sorts of services like, being maids, things like that. Again, these were jobs that men could have done also, but by not having the men do them, the men could be out on the ships to fight instead. Through these sorts of means, the United States quickly built a vast army. 4 million people were brought into the United States military during this time period. 2 million of them were sent across Europe to participate in the First World War in 1917. Those who went across to fight were known as the American Expeditionary Force. Now, why did not all 4 million go? Because you need a vast system of support for the 2 million that do go. You need a system to build and gather and organize supplies and ship them. You need a system to train additional soldiers, stuff like that. So you had 2 million of them that remained behind in America, manning the bases that were here. But 2 million did go. This is a vast number to be thrown into a conflict which is at near stalemate. This then gave the French and the British the push that they need to actually begin to win the war. Well, while the battling begins to take place in Europe with the American troops in place, we also need to consider what was happening at home among the people that were left behind. And I don't just mean the soldiers that left behind. I mean the public that's left behind. What is their role in this war fighting? Well, the first thing to recognize is the economic power of the United States that can now be brought to bear to directly help the Allies. With the United States no longer claiming to be neutral, we could focus all our trade on helping Great Britain and France, and to some extent Russia too. Now, the Germans saw this coming, and they knew what they needed to do was sink even more American ships before they could get across the Atlantic and aid the British and the French. So in the lead up to the United States actually declaring war, this became a race. Could the Germans sink enough of the American ships that then the British and the French couldn't get enough supplies, that Germany could win the war before America got there? Or would America actually come into the war soon enough to aid the Allies to defeat the Germans? This was the great question before the United States actually entered the war, because everyone recognized that the economic power of the United States would be a determining factor if it actually came to bear in assistance to the Allies. Now, to get people in the United States ready to fight against the Germans, propaganda was required. Propaganda is communication used by the government, oftentimes exaggerated or even dishonest, to sway the people's opinion in favor of what the government's trying to do. This is commonly done in war, historically. So in 1917, the United States government set up a Committee on Public Information, more commonly known as the Creel Committee, designed to purposely produce propaganda to persuade Americans to go fight. They did this both by providing information, such as the bulletin you see on the left, in which they tried to say, okay, you may have been hearing negative things about the war, but here's the truth about it. Now, the truth was the government's truth, which may or may not have actually been accurate, because remember, the point is to get people to support the war, not just to inform them. Then on the other side, you've got a more negative approach, such as this poster that was put up to try to get people to join the U.S. Army. It portrays the Germans as mad brutes, as beasts that are trying to rape women and destroy our culture. The reason you do this kind of thing is it's much more easy to go fight and kill someone if you don't think of them as really human. If you think of the Germans as mad beasts, then maybe you'll be willing to take up a gun and shoot them. Well, not everyone was willing to go along with the propaganda. Some people dissented from the war and tried to get other people to dissent. They tried to get the United States to not go to war, and then after we had chosen to go to war, to get people to not participate and the United States withdraw. So 2 laws were passed, one in 1917 and then a set of amendments in 1918 to try to crush this dissent. The original law was the Espionage Act. The set of amendments added to it were called the Sedition Act. Espionage is when essentially you spy. You actively provide information and assistance to an enemy in some sort of secret way. Sedition is when you actively oppose the government and try to get others to oppose it. And so these acts prevented people from doing things, from saying things, from advocating things that it was believed would inhibit the war effort. So, for example, when the draft was instituted, if a person went out and tried to get people to not go along with the draft, they could be arrested under the Espionage and Sedition Acts. If you even went about speaking against the war in a negative light, you could be arrested under the Espionage and Sedition Acts. And what happened was several anti-draft activists and even newspaper editors were thrown in jail for speaking out against the war. These are the kind of things that under our modern interpretation of the First Amendment and its protection of freedom of speech and freedom of the press we would not allow. But these were standard operating procedure during this time period of American history when the United States got into conflicts like this. So as I said, with the U.S. troops getting to Europe, the tide of the war was going to turn. The Allies were destined to then win once the United States decided to become part of their cause. But there were some things that had to happen first before we reached the eventual ceasefire that effectively ended the war. That ceasefire is called an armistice. So let's talk about what happened between the time the United States entered the war and the armistice that brought the ceasefire. First of all, the United States figured out a way to get its troops and supplies mostly safely across the ocean, despite the German U-boats. Everything would travel in convoys, large groups of ships moving together, kind of like a herd of animals out on the prairie or the grasslands, trying to avoid attacking wolves or lions. You have lots of buffalo or gazelle or wildebeest or whatever that will huddle together. Now the benefit this provides is that there's many eyes to look out for the predator. And also the predator can't eat you all. So it may just have to pick off a few stragglers around the edge, but the bulk of the herd gets through. The same idea was used here. Keep a bunch of ships together, have some protecting naval ships with them, and the U-boats will not be as effective. And it worked wonderfully. Successful attacks on the American ships crossing the Atlantic dropped precipitously during this time. This is how we could get men and supplies safely across the ocean. Another big event after the United States entered the war, before the armistice came, was the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, led by Vladimir Lenin. He was an activist that had for years tried to convince people that Russia should become a communist country. And the instability of the First World War gave him his opportunity. The Russian army was in disarray. It was losing to the Germans on the frontier. This caused the Russian government to collapse. And it gave Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik revolutionaries the opportunity to step into that vacuum, to take power in Russia and turn it into the communist country that it would be for the decades to follow. One of the first acts that this new communist government did once they were in power was to reach a peace deal with the Germans. They no longer wanted to be part of the First World War fight. They wanted to focus on consolidating their power within Russia. This then allowed the Germans to withdraw their troops from the Russian frontier and bring them over to fight the French and the English and now the Americans. So once they had these extra troops, the Germans went on an offensive. They tried to move forward to break the stalemate and quickly win the war. But with the backing of the United States, the French and the English were able to now stage a series of counteroffensive and push back the German advances and take the initiative themselves and to begin to drive the Germans back into Germany. At that point, it became clear that the Germans were going to lose this war. This then led to the Armistice of 1918, signed in a railroad car that is still preserved, and you can go see it in a museum. The Germans came to peace with the English and the French and the Americans. And as part of that peace, Kaiser Wilhelm, the King of Germany, abdicated. He stepped down. And a new government came into power in Germany that was more willing to make peace. Even as the war was being fought and coming to a conclusion in Europe, there was another major world event happening at the exact same time. That was the influenza pandemic. A pandemic is when a disease spreads around the globe. Influenza is what we know today as the common flu. The influenza pandemic began in 1918, we believe in Kansas. Some soldiers caught the flu from a chicken farm nearby to their military base. It began as a bird flu that crossed over into humans. They either caught the disease directly from the chickens, which were sold to be eaten on the base, or from the chicken farmers who came and sold them at the base. However it happened, the flu quickly spread through America's largest military training facility. Now, this is in the beginning of the World War I. So troops are coming through this base and then getting distributed to other bases across the country. Also, those who create their basic training are being sent back home before they start their active service for a little vacation before they get shipped across the ocean. And they carry the disease back home. Quickly, the influenza spreads around the country. And along the way, it ends up making many, many people sick. But the worst is yet to come. Soldiers carry influenza to Europe, and there it mutates into a more virulent strain, which then continues to spread around the globe, bringing death and destruction before it. About 50 million people worldwide die from this pandemic of influenza. It ends up getting the nickname the Spanish flu. And the reason is because war news in the warring countries was censored by the government. Just as I talked about previously, them using propaganda to try to influence people, they also tried to prevent others' bad influence by censoring the press. And they did not want people to know that a new disease was ravaging our troops. Gosh, if people knew that, they might not volunteer for the army. They might say, we need to bring these soldiers home to get healthy. Didn't want that. So in the countries that were fighting the war, news of the pandemic was controlled. It was eliminated. So what happened was the first big reports of this pandemic spreading actually came from Spain. It's not where the Spanish flu originated, but that's where people first publicly found out about it. And that's how it got the nickname at the time, the Spanish flu. Well, the Spanish flu spread around the globe, all the way from the Inuits in the Arctic to Samoans in the Pacific. Every country in the world ended up catching the Spanish flu, and it killed millions of people. Now you can say, well, how does the flu not do that today? Well, the flu continued to mutate. And what happens is diseases, generally speaking, will mutate to a less destructive form. And the reason is if they kill off all their hosts, then there's no one to spread the disease to others. So they can't be too deadly or they can't spread. So eventually it would mutate into the flu we know today. But that's still deadly for some people. And there's still advice that you should get vaccinated against the flu because it could potentially kill you. Well, the Spanish flu was the most virulent strain of influenza, and it killed millions. And more particularly, it killed people in the prime of life. 20, 30, 40-year-olds dropped dead from it, just as easily as people in what you would think would be more fragile age groups, like the young and the old. No, it struck down people in the prime of their life. So while the world went through its battle of World War I and its battle against the Spanish flu at the same time, Woodrow Wilson came up with a plan that he thought could bring world peace. The centerpiece of this plan was something called the League of Nations. Woodrow Wilson outlined his plan in a series of 14 points. Now that's a lot to think about, so I'm not going to tell you about all 14 points. Just know that it was a plan that he came up for how nations should deal with each other in the future to maintain world peace. Well, he decided to try to advance that plan by helping settle the peace that ended the First World War in Europe. He traveled overseas to be part of the peace negotiations in Paris in 1918. This was the first time that a U.S. president had traveled across the ocean to visit another country. Now, other presidents such as Teddy Roosevelt had visited other countries. Teddy Roosevelt had gone to Panama while he was president to see what was happening with the Panama Canal. But Woodrow Wilson was the first one to go across the ocean to Europe or Asia. And he ended up staying there for 6 months while President of the United States to try to negotiate peace in Europe based on his 14 points. Eventually a peace treaty was signed. It was called the Treaty of Versailles because it was negotiated at a big palace outside Paris that had been formerly used by the kings of France. This treaty that was negotiated was a brutal treaty. It was a treaty designed to punish the Germans for starting the war. The most brutal part of it was a demand for German reparations, that Germany pay back France and England for the destruction of the war. In today's dollars, Germany was required to pay $450 billion to the Allies that they had fought against. This was an impossible task to ask of the Germans, an oppressive task. Germany was also given limits on how big its military could be, and some of its territory was occupied by the French. These were all viewed as insults by the German people that would eventually lead to the rise of Hitler and World War II. But the key piece of peace for Woodrow Wilson was the establishment of the League of Nations. The League of Nations would essentially be a club of all countries in the world where they could work out their differences peacefully. But most importantly, there'd be a dedication to collective security. The idea that if you attacked unreasonably any member of the League of Nations, then you would effectively be saying that you were going to war against the entire League of Nations. And in this way, it would discourage countries from going to war with each other. Although this was Woodrow Wilson's baby, his thing that he had designed to bring peace to the world, the United States never joined. The reason was because under our system of government, the president may agree to a treaty, but it does not become binding upon the United States of America unless the United States Senate approves it. And the United States Senate did not. Henry Cabot Lodge, a prominent senator, opposed the treaty because he believed that it would deprive America of control over its own destiny. He believed that it would put the League of Nations in the place of deciding who the United States might go to war against, for example. We could be badly treated by another country, but if the League of Nations said, no, 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 then we couldn't do anything about it. He didn't want to give up that kind of American sovereignty, so he opposed the treaty and tried to get his fellow senators to oppose it. Woodrow Wilson went out to campaign for the treaty on a train tour around the country to convince the public it was a good thing, in hopes that they would then convince their senators. But he had a stroke during his train trip and was an invalid for the rest of his presidency. He was no longer able to campaign for the treaty, and Henry Cabot Lodge won the day, and the treaty was defeated in the United States Senate. Without the United States part of the League of Nations, it lost its real power. The United States was the superpower in the world, with its vast economy and now strong military. But without the U.S. support in the League of Nations, it had no way to enforce any of its mandates. And it ended up eventually just withering and going away. Now let's discuss the aftermath of the war. What happened to countries around the world and in the United States after the war was over? An area that we haven't really talked about yet, which was involved in the war, was the near Middle East. I mentioned the Ottoman Empire early in this chapter. I didn't tell you along the way that the Ottoman Empire joined the war on the side of the Central Powers, on the side of Germany and Austro-Hungary. So when the World War I came to an end, and that group of Central Powers was defeated, the Ottoman Empire was defeated along with them. And their lands were overrun by the British and the French and the Americans. The question then became what to do with those Ottoman lands. Woodrow Wilson sent in a group of advisors called the King Crane Commission that toured the region to try to decide what to do with the peoples there. They came back and advised that they should be allowed to determine their own destiny, that that's what they wanted. They didn't want to be occupied by European powers. Well, despite that recommendation, the European powers, in a treaty of Sèvres, decided to divide up the Middle East into what they called mandates. They allowed some independent countries to come into existence or remain in existence, such as Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. But they split up other pieces of what had been the Ottoman Empire and set them up as what they called mandates, where a foreign government would rule over them. The belief was that the people in these mandates did not have the capacity to properly rule themselves. So they needed a European power to come in and take over and teach them how to govern themselves. The French took over what is now Syria. The British took over what is now Iraq. The British took over what would eventually be divided into the states of Jordan and Israel. The United States was offered to come in and be part of this system, to take over some of these mandates, but the United States declined the offer. The United States felt that we had our own things to worry about at home. Remember our long history of avoiding foreign entanglements. Yes, we'd got involved in World War I to make the world safe for democracy, but that doesn't mean that we wanted to be occupying other countries around the world, like the mandate system in the Middle East. As I said, we had our own problems to take care of. What was viewed as a major problem at this time was the Red Scare, the concern about the rise of communism in America. Remember, there was the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and we had labor unions here in the United States that believed in a sort of collectivism that was similar. And there was a great fear that communism would spread among the labor unions and among the American people during this time period. There was also growing concern about race relations. This was because of the Great Migration. Blacks in the South faced oppression, and when given the opportunity, they packed up and moved en masse, about 6 million of them over a during the decades following the First World War. They moved to big cities in the Northeast. There they found jobs in factories, and those cities became concentrations of African American population in the North. Most of the North out in the countryside is still primarily white, but you ended up with large black populations in these major cities. Well, this then led to conflict as this First World War came to an end. People returned from fighting in the war to try to regain their jobs and move back into their former neighborhoods, only to find that black people had moved in from the South to take those jobs and move into those homes. This then led to race riots between blacks and whites in a number of cities across the country during the summer of 1919. This became known as the Red Summer, not because of communism, which is often associated with the color red, but because of the color of blood, because of the lives lost, the destruction done between these racial conflicts between blacks and whites in these northern cities. And that completes the material in Chapter 21 about the First World War.